just like me. They long to be close to you.
Hi, welcome to our experiment on Proxemics, personal space in Mexico and Oregon. I'm Kimberly Solis, and my companion is Tara Renshaw, and we hope to show you just what happened when we sat down to watch people in our cultures and then compare them to each other as they waited in line. So why worry about understanding the differences in cross-cultural personal space? Why is it really important to us? Well, it is important if you are going to have any kind of interaction with people from another culture, especially if you travel into that culture. We all often think about culture as being a mix of great things like food, tradition, fiestas, music, dance, and all the things that fascinate us about places, for example, like Mexico. But culture has a lot more to do with people than just the things that they do. It's also how they think and how they react to different situations. One of these situations is personal space. We tend to assume that everybody has the same idea as we do in regards to personal space, us being people from the United States. But people in different countries have very different ideas. As you can see in the following pictures, we see people piled onto a motorcycle or into the back of a pickup in ways that we would not necessarily generally practice. But that could be commonplace in other places. People view personal space in very different manners. And if you're traveling, you may end up in a situation of utter confusion about just what to do when somebody gets real close. I wanted to share with you a quick story about a friend of mine who was an American woman who moved to Cozumel, Mexico. And when she was there, she had quite an interesting experience. During one of her first trips to a supermarket to buy groceries, my friend came face to face with the differences in cultural proxemics. Ready to check out, she placed herself in line at what she felt was a normal, comfortable, and respectful distance from the person in front of her, much like the lady in this picture waiting in line to buy chicken. To my friend's surprise and dismay, people gradually started coming up and filling in the gap, cutting in line before her. How rude she thought the Mexican people to be. It wasn't until later that she grew accustomed to the culture that she realized that the other shoppers, upon seeing such a large break in the line, they had simply assumed that she must be waiting for someone and was not actually going to check out. She was standing so far from the person in front of her. They had then just simply filled in the space and let her continue to wait while they got in line to check out. So with this idea in mind, we came up with a hypothesis. Is it true, we wondered, that people in Mexico have less requirements for personal space? They don't seem to need so much space around them? Is it true that people in the United States do require more personal space? Is it true that Mexico is a contact culture, where the United States is a non-contact culture? With these things in mind, we wondered, because each of us live in a different country, just what it would be like to test out this theory. First of all, let me take you to Metepec, Mexico, my home for the past 20 years. It is a suburb to the state's capital, Toluca, a big industrial city. But Metepec is smaller, known for its quaint pottery shops and bustling open-air markets. As you can see, there are hints that things are not as spaced out as in the Northwest. Houses are built one next to the other, often sharing a common wall. Here I am, driving down the street in the center of town. You can see the bright colors, communicating the enthusiasm and joy present in this culture. Here, there are no lanes painted on this part of the street, often lending to a rather organized chaos, as cars zip back and forth in front of Calvary Church up on the hill. For our experiment in cultural proxemics and personal space, we decided to test how much personal space people in general need while they are waiting in line. For this, we chose 3 different places to observe people. Here in Metepec, I chose the mall, At the mall, I went to Starbucks. I then went to the movie theater and later went across the street to a rather large grocery store. First at Starbucks, I watched people waiting in line and counted in a 5-foot amount of space how many people would fit or would share that space as they waited in line to order coffee. I did the same at the movie theater, counting the amount of people in 5 feet of space as they waited in line to buy movie tickets. Later, as you can see here, there's a picture of 3 people waiting in line at the grocery store, waiting to check out. Further on, you can see a small bench, perhaps maybe 5 to 6 feet long, with a bunch of men and boys that were working at the grocery store sitting on it. Note how close they are sitting together, shoulder to shoulder. There's even room on the far end for one more person. So, here are my results from the observation taken in Metepec. Here we see the number of people standing in line in a 5-foot amount of space: Starbucks, the movie theater, and the grocery store. I took random counts as the line advanced so that I could get an average of how many people normally stood in line. You can see at times there were 3, at times 4, maybe 2, and even up to 5 people in a 5-foot amount of space. It was interesting. It was obvious these were not people who had come together. They were 2 separate groups who felt that was just the right amount of space they needed to have between themselves. So here we have the average people in line. After watching and observing many groups of people, there was an average of 3 people to every 5 feet of space at Starbucks. The movie theater had an average of 3.9 people, nearly 4 people for every 5 feet of space. And at the grocery store, I also found an average of 3 people for every 5 feet of space. So in conclusion, for Metepec, Mexico, there was an average of 3.3 people in line for every 5 feet of space, which means in the Mexican culture, people require an average of 18.23 inches of personal space around them in order to feel comfortable while waiting in line. Now let's go to Oregon, up in the northwest corner of the United States, the city of Corvallis, the other site of the second part of our experiment. Oregon also has a culture all its own. We can talk about stagecoaches and the Wild West, the Indians, the rodeos. All of this is part of Oregon's history and part of Oregon's present. If you look around town in Corvallis, you'll see quite a different picture than what you saw back in Mexico. You can see the streets have wider lanes and the buildings are more spaced out, with space in between each one. A big part of Oregon culture, and especially in Corvallis, is the university, Oregon State University. Another part of Oregon culture would be the rivalry between Oregon State University and the University of Oregon. But what does all this have to do with personal space? Well, Tara Renshaw set out to find out just what would happen when she observed people waiting in line in a 5-foot amount of space. How many people would there be in Oregon occupying that space? So she set out to examine much the same kind of places as were done in Mexico. She went to the grocery store, Safeway. She went to the movie theater, and she also went to a coffee shop. So in conclusion, in Oregon, the average people in line for every 5 feet of space was 2.2. Which means in the U.S. culture, each person requires an average of 27.23 inches of personal space. So in conclusion, in Oregon, the average people in line for every 5 feet of space was 2.2, which means in the U.S. culture, each person requires an average of 27.23 inches of personal space. So what is the conclusion of all this? Basically, it is true. The Mexican culture requires less personal space. The United States culture requires much more personal space. And this is obvious if you've been in either one of these cultures, or if you've been where these two cultures intersect. In the United States, you may see people that are Mexican or Latin American, kind of crowding together. You might feel like they're getting in your face sometimes, but that's the way that their culture is. On the flip side, if you are from the Latin culture, you may feel that the Americans are kind of distant and standoffish. These are the results of differing cultural proxemics and the impact that they may have on our lives.
We can see